Hello, everyone. Get everyone to populate in. Hi there.
Hi, how you doing?
Pretty good. All right. So the way this is going to work is I'll just tell you about who I am and how this kind of came about. My name is JeanPaul Cleveland. I'm the director of the Polytechnic Tutoring Center at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Also associate professor, adjunct associate professor of philosophy at Pace University, the downtown campus. And this presentation is actually two presentations put together from two times that I presented this on doing several different philosophers at a thing called Nerd Night. Nerd Night is this, well, there's actually a lot of nerd nights all over the United States, all over the world. And they do this nerd night at, it's like a performance art space in Brooklyn called Littlefield. It's kind of on the border of Gowanus and Park Slope. And these nerd nights are like 20-minute presentations given by three different people speaking on different topics. And it's like a combination of TED Talk and stand-up comedy. So it's kind of interesting. And I had a friend that did it once, and he presented on Let's Get Saxy, the saxophone in 1980s music. And he would have clips of 1980s music and the saxophone, and it was kind of really neat and whatnot. So it was kind of fun, and I said, I think I could probably do this. So that's how this came about. So yeah, let's get going. So first of all, it's interactive, so I want to know if you know. Let's see, get this going here. Advance this. Oh, yeah, who said this? All is water.
I am not sure.
All is water.
I do not know.
I'll give you a hint. It was this guy. This guy. Any others? I know, it's great. Now you can figure it out, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, here you go. This is, oops, my thing isn't, there we go. Slides aren't advancing. There we go. Okay, this is, yeah, you can see his dates there. Thales of Miletus. Yeah, he's one of what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers. He comes from Miletus, which is in modern-day coastal Turkey. He's among he said that all is water. Everything comes from water, everything is made from water, and everything goes back to water. Water is the primary element from which everything is composed, is the primary element of the universe. And it's also interesting that Thales has two different kinds of sides to him, two different stories that are told about him that demonstrate his great practical skills, and yet also about him being an unworldly dreamer. Okay, so this is the guy you want with you at the commodities desk at the New York Stock Exchange or at the New York Mercantile Exchange. Aristotle, for example, relates the story of how Thales used his great skills to deduce that the next season's olive crop would be a very large one. And therefore, he bought up all of the olive presses, kind of cornering the market. And he was able to make a fortune when, in fact, the bumper olive crop did arrive, which is great for him. But on the other hand, Plato tells the story of how one night, Thales was going along and gazing up at the sky, and he fell into a ditch. And a pretty servant girl lifted him out of the ditch and said to him, "How do you expect to understand what is going on up at the sky if you do not even understand what is at your feet?" I guess that's the first absent-minded professor joke of the West. Anyway, off with this guy. Okay, next up. Who said this? The unexamined life is not worth living.
I am not sure. I don't know too much, so you might hear that quite a few times.
That's fine too. Well, I'll give you a hint. It'd be this guy. Any other ideas?
No.
Yeah, I know. This is a marble bust, right? Okay. Well, that's Socrates. Okay. So most people know Socrates as the granddaddy of philosophy, although, as we saw, that title might properly belong to Thales of Miletus, who lived couple hundred years before Socrates. But yeah, Socrates is super duper the granddaddy of all philosophy. He was convicted on the twin charges of impiety towards the gods and corruption of the youths, or as they would say in Bay Ridge, youths. And for such crimes, he was sentenced to die by drinking the powerful neurotoxin hemlock, which he did in the year 399 BCE when he was 70 years old. That's a famous painting there of him. Yeah, it's kind of sad. And here he is teaching them and telling them to shut up and stop crying, and they can't help themselves. Too bad. But let's see, my slides aren't advancing. There we go. But back to Socrates. Socrates, yeah. Oh, I should go back. I'm gonna go this way. But we should also talk about Socrates' most famous pupil. You know who this is on the right? Anybody?
No.
Anybody guesses? This is his most famous pupil, Socrates' most famous pupil. This is Plato. Let me put up his dates. There we go. Yeah, that's Plato. Plato is actually not his real name. It's actually Aristocles, probably named after his grandfather. But Platon is a moniker. It's a nickname. It means broad-shouldered one. So I guess he was built like a linebacker, as you can see here. It's like, hey, daddy. But anyway, back to Socrates. Socrates described himself as short, fat, ugly, and he stunk. That's because he rarely took a bath, which I'm sure did not go down well with his wife Xanthippe. But anyway, he did take a bath on the day of his execution. I guess it was a really momentous occasion, I suppose. But in the dialogue, the Meno, a young friend named Meno calls Socrates a torpedo fish, owing not only to how he looks, but also because of the way in which people usually found themselves dumbstruck and at a loss for words upon Socrates' questioning of them. That is a torpedo fish, also known as the electric ray, which has electric properties in order to stun its prey.
Yeah.
Can see the resemblance? Oh, okay, enough with him. Okay, who said this? I preferred the weapons of dialectic to all the other teachings of philosophy, and armed with these, I chose the conflicts of disputation rather than the trophies of war. Any guesses? Probably not, right?
No.
No? Okay, well, it would be this guy. Who is this?
Still no guesses?
Yeah, a lot of people think, oh, that's Jesus. No, it's not Jesus. It's a medieval Frenchman. A medieval Frenchman. Well, okay, so it's Peter Abelard. He is the author of Sic et Non, but I can't put up him without putting up her. Any guesses on who this is?
Looks like we're getting some guesses in chat too.
Okay, good. Oh yes, that is Abelard. You're right. Yes, it is Peter Abelard. On the right, or on the left there, as you can see. And any guesses to who this is this young lady over here with her eyes rolled back up at her head? Okay, well, this would be, let me see. There we go. Heloise d'Argenteuil. And yes, her eyes are all rolled back up in her head because that's because of all the sex these two were having. So Abelard took under his wing this brilliant and engaging young lady named Heloise. It was a tutor-student relationship, and they soon fell deeply in love with each other, notwithstanding the age as well as the power difference in the relationship. Their relationship quickly became physical. They even engaged in flagrante delicto, which means sex, in the corner of the convent refectory, the only place where they could snatch a moment alone together. See, Abelard convinced the lay leader of the church, whose name was Fulbert, who was actually Heloise's uncle, to let him move into his house, telling Fulbert that he could not afford to live in his own house while studying, and offered to tutor Heloise in return. How convenient. Then so Abelard tells of their subsequent illicit relationship, and which they continued until Heloise became pregnant. Oops. Abelard moved Heloise away from Fulbert as the situation in the household became quite intense, and he sent her to his own sister in Brittany, where Heloise gave birth to a boy who she named Astrolabe. Yes, you heard me right. Astrolabe. I guess it's a precursor of it's a naval navigation device, I guess, to chart your way through the stars. It's like it's the precursor to the sextant, I think. But anyway, virtually nothing is known of Astrolabe later in life. Abelard agreed to marry Heloise to conciliate Fulbert on the condition that the marriage should be kept secret so as not to damage Abelard's career. Heloise was initially reticent to agree to this secret marriage, but was eventually persuaded by Abelard. Heloise returned from Brittany, and the couple were secretly married in Paris. Fulbert, however, began to spread news of the marriage in order to punish Abelard for the damage done to his reputation. Heloise attempted to deny this, but this ongoing situation eventually caused Abelard to place Heloise for her own safety in the convent of Argenteuil, where Heloise had been brought up. But Fulbert and his friends, however, believed that what Abelard was trying to do was just trying to get rid of Heloise by making her a nun, which wasn't the case. So to punish Abelard, a group of Fulbert's friends broke into Abelard's room one night and castrated him. I don't know. I have no personal experience with this, but I think once you've been castrated, all the sexual and sensual yearnings and longings kind of exit from you. And so Abelard and Heloise's relationship did change. Abelard continued to teach and write in Paris, but he also took up religious orders and himself became a monk. And he suggested that Heloise remain at the convent of Argenteuil, where she eventually became a nun and worked her way up to be an abbess. And through their famous correspondence of 20 years, which you can actually read, the love letters of Abelard and Heloise, their love, although completely different from what it was before, did continue to flourish in spite of their separation. They never saw each other again, which is unfortunate, because if you know where Argenteuil is, okay, he's in the center of Paris. Argenteuil is on the Haute de Seine. It's just on the other side of the frickin' river. I don't know. It's but they never saw each other again. It's one of the greatest and tragic love stories ever told. Okay, off with them. Anybody know who said this? I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. Anybody know? Any guesses? Descartes, yes. That would be this guy, Rene Descartes. Yeah, nice weave, huh? This guy is the father of modern rationalism. In addition to being a preeminent philosopher, and he was a great mathematician, and you can thank Descartes for all of your headaches in your middle school years. He's the one who came up with the quadrant system that bears the Latinized version of his name, of his last name, the Cartesian quadrilateral here. In fact, he invented analytic geometry, which is the algebraic expression of the relationships among line segments. And so, yes, nearly everybody knows, you know, that Descartes' famous dictum, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum in the Latin, or pense donc je suis. Okay, so I think, therefore I am. Okay, so this reminds me of a joke, but that's because everything reminds me of a joke. Descartes was sitting in a Paris salon once, and the waitress comes up to him and says, "Monsieur, café?" And he says, "I think not." Poof! Okay, crickets. Should not quit my day job, I guess. So anyway, okay. So after having lived in Paris and in various places in France as well as Amsterdam, Descartes was invited in September of 1649 to come to Stockholm, Sweden, to be the court tutor of the young Queen Christina of Sweden. And she was brilliant in her own right. And by the way, who wouldn't want the leading intellectual light of all of Europe as a jewel in your crown. She was very interested in mathematics and philosophy and the arts. She was the most educated woman of the 17th century. And Descartes tutored her in various subjects. In addition, she commissioned Descartes to write a play for her, which he reluctantly did. But Christina, I mean, she's head of state. She had business to do. She had him up at 5 a.m. most mornings. And I gotta say that Descartes was no morning person. I mean, it's a good thing if he started the day at 11. But he was no morning person. And so that combined with the harsh Swedish winter proved to be too much for him. And in January 1650, Descartes caught pneumonia, and by February he was dead. Poor guy. But one last word about Christina. She actually abdicated her throne in 1654 at the age of 28, owing partly for her refusal to marry, as well as her conversion to Roman Catholicism, because Sweden was a Lutheran country. Among many things, after retiring as queen, she traveled to Rome, where she founded a theater company. You go, girl. That's good. I like that. All right. So, who said this? Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law. Any ideas? Act as if the maxim of your action would become through your will a universal law. Give you a hint. This guy here. Any other ideas? No? No? Okay. Immanuel Kant, preeminent Enlightenment philosopher. He did nothing. Okay, nothing salacious, but he did write and teach, but he did nothing. I mean, he had no extramarital affairs. In fact, he was never married. There's nothing juicy. There's no juicy stories about this guy. This guy is a kind of a prude. I mean, he even called coitus heterosexual intercourse. He even called that internal masturbation. That's what he called it. This guy, well, so Immanuel Kant was born and died in Königsberg, East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia. He didn't even travel any more than 150 kilometers outside Königsberg. As I said, he did nothing salacious, but he wrote, and he wrote copiously, but even most of his writing occurred late in life. I don't even think he started writing until into his 50s. So if you are up for any kind of self-flagellation or challenge, you should read Kant. It is very dense, very difficult philosophical material. The Critique of Practical Reason, The Critique of Pure Reason, very difficult books. The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Every sentence, every paragraph is just weighty. It's very dense philosophical material, but it's quite good. Anyway, off with him. Okay, so tell me this. Who said this? The doctor sees all the weakness of humankind, the lawyer all the wickedness, and the theologian all the stupidity. Any ideas? Any? I'll give you a hint. It'd be this pessimist. Who is this pessimist? Any ideas? Okay, so this is Arthur Schopenhauer, best known for his 1818 work, The World as Will and Representation, in which he characterizes the phenomenal world of things and stuff as the product of a blind, insatiable, malignant, metaphysical will. He claimed to have identified Immanuel Kant's thing in itself, the Ding an sich, as the will, which he called a blind urge, a blind urge. And the will is expressed in all things, from the lowest gradations of the will, such as the elemental forces of electromagnetism and gravity, all the way up to the highest manifestations of the will, which would be us. In addition, and Schopenhauer had some things to say about love. Anybody been in love before? Yeah? Anybody been in love or love now? Well, it's so sweet. It's so sweet. Well, you know, Herr Schopenhauer has some things to say about that, right? Well, for Schopenhauer, we are duped by our own biology into thinking that we have a rational capacity for romantic love, when all the while it is nothing more than the will to propagate the species that is rising up in us. That is, when we think we choose a mate, we think we are acting of our own rational accord, but that is an illusion operating on an unconscious level. It is the will to further our species, and we are dragged along in that project. In fact, he likens our experience in this regard to a parasitic wasp known as the ichneumon wasp. That is the ichneumon wasp. Now, you've heard of murder hornets, right? Well, kind of the same type of thing. It's the same operation here. With the ichneumon wasp, the female finds another insect host, such as a caterpillar, and lays the eggs on or near or inside the host insect's body. Upon hatching, the larval ichneumon feeds either externally or internally, killing the host when it's ready to pupate. Schopenhauer compares the unconscious will to propagate our species to the wasp's parasitic behavior. We are being used by our own biology for purposes that we didn't design. And so our love is but an illusion. But Schopenhauer did himself fall in love. Yep. In his early 30s, while teaching in Berlin, Schopenhauer fell in love with a 19-year-old opera singer, Caroline Richter, and had a relationship with her for several years. He did not marry her, though, but despite Caroline's urging, he never planned to marry, claiming that, okay, and these are his words, marrying means to half one's rights and double one's responsibilities. Half one's rights and double one. This is a nice guy, right? The abrupt and fading relationship between the two lasted about 10 years. It seems that Schopenhauer mistrusted her possible motives, which together with worries about her health and jealousy of other lovers of the singer was the reason why the engagement never came about. In 1831, oops, she had a child by another man, which eventually ended her involvement with Schopenhauer. The other man, Louis Medon, would eventually abandon Caroline, which made her available to Schopenhauer once again. But by then she had contracted tuberculosis, and his fear of contracting her disease outweighed his love for her, and he never saw her again. There's also, this is Schopenhauer again, there's also the story told about him, about the stunning and brilliant social lioness, Flora Weiss, who was 17 years old, and Schopenhauer was 43. When he saw her at a boat party on the Rhine, he approached her with a cluster of grapes in order to introduce himself. Flora found him to be, as she said, a porcupine of a man, and was offended by his foul breath. After she accepted the grapes, when Schopenhauer wasn't looking, she threw them overboard. Concerned because he had touched them, she did not want to catch any of his afflictions. Schopenhauer occupied himself throughout the rest of his life writing and teaching, but he had no success with women. He lived mostly a lonely life with a succession of poodles. His dogs gave him great joy and satisfaction, and he lavished attention on them. In fact, late in life, he took a very keen philosophical interest in animal welfare. Good for him. That's nice, right? Nice. Okay. See ya. All right. Who said this? What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Any ideas? What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. No?
Is it Nietzsche?
Nietzsche, yes. Most people say Um, most people want to say, what's her name? Kelly Clarkson, the breakaway philosopher of our time. But no, yes, it was Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah. Yes. And while a lot of things can be said about his philosophy and life, I want to zero in on the year 1882. Nietzsche met the brilliant and engaging Lou von Salome that year when she was 21, he was in his early 30s. Lou was this Russian-born immigrant who would eventually go on to be a muse for the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, as well as an associate of Sigmund Freud. Lou and Nietzsche met through their mutual friend, that's her dates. They met through their mutual friend, Paul Ray. And Ray was deeply interested in psychology and philosophy and was, like Nietzsche, profoundly influenced by the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. These three friends met up on and off over a 7-month period of 1882 at various places through which they were traveling in northern Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. Lou saw in Nietzsche a brilliant mentor and for her budding interests. Nietzsche saw in Lou perhaps a love partner, a life partner. In fact, Nietzsche even asked Lou to marry him 3 times during that 7-month period, and each time she declined. In fact, Nietzsche asked his friend Paul Ray to ask on his behalf the first 2 times, to ask her to marry him the first 2 times, oblivious to the fact that there was actually a love interest brewing between Lou and Paul Ray. The 3 friends made a pact that they would live and study together in the winter of 1882-1883. But things took a downward turn for Nietzsche. First, his doting sister here, this is Elizabeth Nietzsche, as well as his mother, did not like Lou Salome. They thought she was an uncouth lady, even though she was from a very prominent family. Elizabeth believed that her brother needed a proper muse. And also, it appears that Elizabeth Nietzsche suffered from jealousy, as here she was, an unmarried woman in her 30s. And also, during this time, another relationship went south. By the late summer of 1882, Nietzsche made his final break with the composer Richard Wagner. The straw that they were friends, and collaborators, but the straw that broke the camel's back was the debut of Parsifal at the Bayreuth Festival. Nietzsche did not approve because Parsifal contained what he thought were Christian themes. And so Nietzsche felt intellectually betrayed by Wagner. Lou von Salome actually called the 3 friends and their intellectual relationship, and I'm going to get this wrong, but die Dreieinigkeit, which means the Trinity. Well, their pact to study together the following winter really never came to pass. Lou and Ray continued their love relationship and lived happily for several years, but it was not a lasting one. Lou eventually married Carl Friedrich Andreas until his death in 1930. But for Nietzsche, late in the year 1882 was difficult, and he suffered from depression. But he emerged in spectacular fashion in 1883 with even more prolific writings, one of which being Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Amazing, amazing. Definitely read it if you get a chance. That is until the year 1888, which was the last year before his permanent incapacitation. So this painting, or this photograph here is actually interesting. It was taken by the famous Swiss photographer Jules Brunet. Pretty interesting. Tells a lot about the relationship, the Dreieinigkeit, the Trinity. Because you look at them, I mean, look at her she is being pulled along, and they staged this, obviously. It's kind of like almost like an inside joke. But she's got a whip in her hand, and Paul and Nietzsche are, like, what are they, oxen or something? It's that just tells you a lot about their kind of relationship. All right, next up. Who said this? Existence precedes essence. Any ideas? Yeah? No? Okay, I'll give you a hint. This ugly guy.
I forgot how you say his name. It's like Sartre or something. I forget.
Yes, JeanPaul Sartre. There you go. That's it. Yes. And yes. So JeanPaul Sartre, preeminent existentialist philosopher, novelist, and playwright of the 20th century. He told us that the motto of existentialism is existence precedes essence. And if you ever get a chance to read his writings, they are very, okay, so he wrote a book called, it's the preeminent place of his existentialist philosophy. It's called Being in Nothingness. It's extremely difficult to read. Sartre wrote in a purposefully rococo, very ornate style, and it is very difficult to read. But I want to say the best piece, though, it's this essay called Existentialism is a Humanism. It's the most user-friendly, easy to read way of understanding Sartrean existentialist philosophy. Sartre actually disavowed that particular essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, because he felt, according to his own opinion, that it was just too easy. Like, as if philosophy should be hard to read, as if it should be off the charts, super duper difficult. I don't know. I quite disagree with that kind of philosophy, or that kind of attitude. But anyway, okay. So JeanPaul Sartre, but I can't put up him without putting up her. Who is this? Any ideas? Okay. Well, this is Simone de Beauvoir, philosopher, existentialist philosopher, playwright, and novelist in her own right, the author of La Deuxième Sexe, The Second Sex. They were lifetime lovers, but they were never married. Now, the problem with these two is not who were they having sex with, it's who weren't they having sex with. Their usual MO, their kind of thing was that they would befriend a young graduate student or an undergrad, perhaps even, and take that young person under their wing to be an intellectual. They would talk philosophy, they would mentor that person, and it would be like a budding relationship. And then if things would get physical, they would turn in that direction. The first stop would be that it was always a young lady. The young lady, the ingenue, would be seduced first by Simone de Beauvoir, and then later she would introduce Sartre into the relationship, which is pretty unfortunate because Sartre was supposedly said to be pretty bad in bed because he was rather selfish. And plus, look at him. Look at him. That's a big old no. Just a no. There is an apocryphal story. Sartre preceded Simone de Beauvoir in death. And I don't know if this story is true. The story may be apocryphal, kind of like a legend, a myth, or whatever. But the story goes that, they were on and off. They were intellectual partners throughout life. They never married. But upon Sartre's death, Simone was so overcome with grief. Again, I don't know if this is true, that she couldn't let go. She decided that she would stay the night with his corpse. I don't think she did anything wrong, and I'm not saying that. No. But I mean, she just couldn't leave his bed. She couldn't leave his bedside. Again, I don't know if that story is actually true. She was so overcome with grief. So, yeah, I don't know. Okay, well, that's the end of our story. Really, I tell you, what I really should entitle this is, instead of The Curious and Quirky Lives of Philosophers, I should just call it Losers Trying to Get Women. So, I don't know. Yeah, so do you have any comments or questions or anything that struck you about these folks?
It's interesting to see them more as like people rather than just like their like works of writing and their actual like philosophical thoughts. It's interesting to see like that background and like what their life was like, even for some of them like not that just didn't do anything whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. It's like when you were a kid and you would see one of your teachers in the at the grocery store, like, oh, you go to the grocery store? Like, you have a life? You know? Yes. We're three-dimensional people. That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments or whatever? Yeah. Well, this has been, yeah.
I think it's like interesting how like these philosophers, in a way, like I feel like some of them would like try to use their theories to justify their lifestyle, or like even if they don't, they would like find a way to kind of make it whole.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Schopenhauer is the only one where some of his, not the only one, I wouldn't want to, is the one who, the way he approached life is kind of borne out in his philosophy. It is a very pessimistic philosophy. I should say, though, that his book, The World as Will and Representation, is dense, but it's extremely well written. It is almost, one could almost say beautiful, even in English translation. And I don't even know what it's looking like in German because I don't read German. But I've heard that it's just as beautiful, if not more beautiful, in German. But it's the first couple of sections are hard to get through, but then it sort of builds on this momentum. And what's interesting about Schopenhauer is the takeaway of his philosophy is it's very pessimistic. The will is the will which animates the world and our lives, as everything from top to bottom, from not only inanimate, but indescribably unconscious forces like magnetism, electromagnetism, like gravity, whether like nuclear forces, and the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, to chemical bonds, to single-celled things, to rocks, to trees, to plants and animals, to us, to all the forces of nature. Everything is strife. Everything is as it is made because there is a clash. There is a, things are at each other. And even on an unconscious, invisible level, all of life from top to bottom is nothing but through and through strife, mutual striving, mutual strife where there's these clashes. Everything is that way. And then the philosophy kind of builds upon this idea to notice that that's how it all is. That's how it works. That's how everything comes to be. And how are we to deal with that? in our own lives, in the elemental forces, in how everything is made and done. How are we to live with that? You come to an understanding of kind of like this stoic resignation. It's a quiet resignation of that, just letting go. And by letting go, developing a sense of compassion. Compassion is the virtue, according to Schopenhauer, in which we're able to, this philosophy could lead to a nihilism, to some sort of either cynicism, like, forget it, screw it, or to a nihilism that we're done for. The world is going to collapse in on itself, and this is it. And that's what it's what it's destined to do. But he offers a philosophy that relies on it's a buildup of kind of, it's a betterment of kind of classical stoicism, kind of a resignation just to accept the way, these are the way things are, which leads us into this deep-seated compassion, this virtue, to be able to say, oh, we're all in this same boat together, then, where this is the way it is for gravity and electromagnetism and chemical reactions and tigers and their prey, and it's the way it is for us in our situation, in our own lives, on a corporate level, on a national level, on a global level. We develop this deep compassion to be able to understand that your suffering is also the same as my suffering, and so on. So I find it, of course, it's not the be all and end all, but I find it deeply compelling, Schopenhauer's philosophy, even though he was an old curmudgeon. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah? Well, this has been a lot of fun. I love this stuff. It's great.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you,
guys. Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Oh, thanks, Deanna, and Randy for hosting. This has been fun. Yay.
Thank you guys for joining us. Stay tuned in the fall. We'll have some more Tandon teaches coming up.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye now.